This week on the Nonprofit News feed, brought to you by Whole Whale, a B Corp digital agency focusing on nonprofit analytics and advertising, although you probably know that if you are listening to this. My name is George Weiner, and I have Nick Azulay, the digital strategist over at Whole Whale. Nick, I'm not going to lie, it seems like we have come up with a few downers here in terms of the administration. I will try to find positive angles or at least helpful angles to this, but why don't you jump into it with the Trump administration halting public student loan forgiveness for select organizations on a whim?
Yeah, George, we have to start out with this top story, and that's that the Trump administration signed an executive order to modify the public service loan forgiveness program. So the order is broad. I don't think the implications are entirely concrete yet, but it aims to exclude nonprofit organizations and their employees from the public student loan forgiveness program if those organizations are engaged in what the order terms, quote, substantial illegal purpose. The move appears to target groups particularly supporting undocumented immigrants, anything involving diversity, gender affirming care, and certain forms of protest. So the PSLF, the Public Student Loan Forgiveness Program, was established in 2007, and the idea that was for people who dedicated their careers to public service, whether it's in the government or in the nonprofit sector, their loans would be forgiven after 10 years broadly of doing those payments, and after which those loans would be forgiven. But it appears here that Trump is essentially trying to just kind of end it for organizations he doesn't like. There's a lot of constitutional scholars say he can't just do this. This is a congressional program. But the implications of this, George, is that people who went to law school or went to graduate school or went to school for the purpose of going into a career in public service, based on the premise that they would get their loans forgiven, people who go into very expensive law school programs to do public interest law, that calculus might make sense, but they may be facing kind of a financial upheaval if this program goes away for employees in particular disciplines. So this is really an attack, George, on nonprofits. It's an attack on any kind of public forgiveness and any kind of help for students taking out loans. I'll say the language of this, George, seems to thematically mirror legislation that we tracked last year at the end, which attempted to loosen the administration's abilities to strip nonprofit organizations of their 501c3 status, right? This seems to kind of fit into that theme of the government wants to make it as hard as possible for folks to go into certain nonprofit careers. The fallouts of this, George, might be significant. It seems that no one really knows what this means in practice, as with all of the policy directives coming out of the White House. But what's your initial reaction?
I mean, somebody with a lot of care and a lot of malice found this nuanced way to attack people that are working on progressive issues that don't align with their culture war. Like, this is like a deep cut. This is the B-side of being truly punitive to people. Not organizations, people, students who walked out with debt, made lifelong decisions of like, I'm going to work the next decade. I'm going to take a pay cut so that I can also afford to work on a cause I care about, but hopefully get these student debts resolved. What's more, they probably were paying the minimum, if that, on that debt, knowing that like, this is part of my plan. I looked into this program myself. I actually left the nonprofit after 7 years. I have other friends that are working off that type of law school debt. And if the rules change on them, I don't know what they do. Tactically, I would imagine they would need to jump over to another 501c3 if that was like a substantial bill and a motive. But I wonder if there isn't a role for foundations, certain foundations, to step up as a potential, bridge employer while that, could happen. That might be a conversation worth having, saying like, hey, could we swap the C3, continue your work here, and use sort of a way to continue under the rules for forgiveness for that grant. But it's just deeply personal and done with people that really know the details and want to harm others. Its callousness is impressive.
Yeah, George, I think that's fair. And I think this is just added stress, right, for a sector that's come under assault. We've had work stop orders, we've had threats to pull funding. It's within this amalgamation of harmful policies designed to kind of destroy any social programming in this country, particularly those programs provided by the nonprofit sector. So we'll continue to follow this, George. From what I read, legal experts are pretty certain Trump just can't do this. It seems to require an act of Congress for the particular reason that you're basically screwing people over. It's like a breach of contract, right? And so it remains to be seen if this is actually upheld. It seems a lot of legal experts think it won't be upheld in the courts, but of course we have to wait and see. All right, George, I want to take us to our next one. And unfortunately, we have to talk about other news coming out of the administration. And this is a little bit of a less severe, but maybe just as telling story. And that is that federal agencies are stripping, quote, woke language from use off their websites and from just broader use in general. This was highlighted really well in a New York Times article that lists the couple hundred words that they're taking out, and anything broadly related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, gender, climate change, social justice, you name it. If it's remotely political, remotely progressive, a word that progressives might use, like maybe like women, just, take government documents reveal that some agencies have ordered removal of these words from the public-facing website. Others have advised caution in their usage. And George, this is an interesting move for an administration that purports to be strong proponents of free speech. JD Vance went to Europe a couple weeks ago and kind of just pontificated about free speech and criticized European countries for, trying to combat hate speech, essentially. And here they are kind of stripping away normal usage language from our federal government and just pretending that certain words and certain topics don't exist. That doesn't seem great.
Yeah, it's a shock to me that you're able to, in two breaths, do the following. One, pontificate about being the party of free speech. Breath number two, here is a long list of words, including not limited to equity, inclusion, women, social justice. The list continues of words you cannot use, of words we are banning. Those are two breaths, one brain that had to do the mental gymnastics necessary to let that level of hypocrisy go out of your face hole. It's impressive, actually. We actually have tools at causewriter.ai/resources that can help you parse through this, at least from a very top level of saying, hey, what parts of this text or this page are going against this ridiculous list? But I don't know what to tell you. Literally the word women is on the list. So when I build these AI tools that analyze that text, okay, I think, it is a chilling effect on speech and a new high bar for hypocrisy from, until next week, tune in.
Yeah, George, I think that's a good point. And as just an aside, I want to point out that just tons of documentation and data and resources are just being deleted from government websites. This is also kind of a trickle-down effect from the destruction of USAID, but just so much, in addition to kind of language, right? So many important resources are just no longer accessible. In a piece from the New Humanitarian, they say that early warning data is going away with regards to famine and hunger crises. So it's kind of not that we are focused on the language piece on this, right? But there's also kind of a destruction just of knowledge within the government web infrastructure, publicly accessible knowledge that's disappearing as well. So just want to call that out, that, they are bending how the government represents governance into a particular ideology, despite what they say about free speech.
Yeah, we mentioned this before. I wrote an article around the fact that, to your point, data and information are directly impacted by how we categorize it and what we can find. Put another way, when you ban the words LGBTQ and don't allow for any sort of this type of gender analysis in our data, youth at risk, for instance, over-index in those categories. And if you suddenly get rid of it, how do you then seek to solve that problem? How do you support that audience? How do you make sure your services are tuned to that? And the truth is you don't, and you lose quite a bit in the data. And unfortunately, that's revealed over time. So the second order effects of magically banning a whole bunch of words is yet to be felt.
Yep, exactly. All right, George. I feel our mood is
I told you, we warned them up front. Like, nobody at this point, nobody's listening.
Nobody's listening. But if they are,
it's fine. I'm listening. What do you want to say? What else we got?
Our mood's actually not that far off from the broader mood of the nonprofit sector. And this is a mood that was measured by the Center for Effective Philanthropy, which released its report entitled Challenging Times, How U.S. Nonprofit Leaders Are Experiencing the Political Context. The key takeaways from this report, George, are that 90% of nonprofit leaders anticipate the political climate to negatively impact their organization. 70% are already experiencing those effects, and 94% expect future effects. And George, I think this is a key piece. Top concern for a nonprofits broadly, is funding uncertainty. And most nonprofits report minimal communication from their foundation funders about the political climate, despite 77% of nonprofit leaders expressing a desire for such communication. So, George, it sounds like foundations are, newsflash, caught off on their back foot, not communicating proactively with nonprofits. And it seems like nonprofits are really feeling the effect of that.
Yeah, that was probably the most telling thing to come out of there. The desire for those in the positions of power at foundations to say something of where they stand in this current moment, to offer some sort of stability, predictability, especially as the funding cut repercussions of government's decisions are rippling through. So, there are some that are making some like really positive statements out there saying like, hey, we're going to increase funding, or we're going to continue funding for this, or, our funding, decisions, unlike the Chan Zuckerberg initiative, are not going to change and suddenly change course overnight, but rather continue the work. I think would go a long way in starting to build back that level of safety, stability needed in the specifically progressive or anybody on the scare list for the current administration.
Yeah. No, George, I exactly agree with you. And I told this to Megan 2 weeks ago, but now's the moment. Now is the time. If you're a foundation sitting on your, $800 million endowment, give out what's a couple $1 million in a time of existential need, right? If not now, then when? And that's all I'm going to say on that.
Yeah, the statement. I'll come back to a point after looking at all of this in total and pulling back of, I am forced to believe that the nonprofit sector, and specifically those that work on progressive issues or even the environment issues, like most nonprofits are incredibly powerful, potentially more powerful than you realize. Look at the amount of tactical energy being spent by the most powerful person in the world right now to silence, crush, remove power, funding from the nonprofit sector. I mean, this is a sector that literally was responsible for only 5% of GDP, but it sure doesn't look like it when you look at what the current attacks and the amount and detail is on going after this tiny little sector, which I'm beginning to realize isn't so tiny, actually has tremendous power on the culture and protection of all Americans. And so there's a reason why these attacks are coming so fast and furious, because the work matters, because the work actually has an impact. So I would say, as I pull for what I'm seeing and in terms of a positive light, that's it. They wouldn't be attacking so hard if your work didn't matter so much. So take it as a compliment, unfortunately, of the impact of what it is that you're putting out there in the world.
Yeah. No, George, I absolutely agree.
Found a bright spot.
Found a bright spot. How does it feel to be personally victimized by the new administration?
Badge of honor, right? They noticed you.
All right, George, I think with all that, we need a feel-good story. This one comes from the Daily Indie. in Nevada, and it writes about an organization called Project 150, a Las Vegas-based nonprofit that's helping disadvantaged teens attend prom regardless of their financial circumstances. Through its annual Prom Closet initiative, the organization transformed a Sahara Las Vegas ballroom into a shopping experience complete with fitting rooms and stylists for nearly 1,800 students. That's double the number from when the project started 7 years ago. And they've expanded to 2 locations in Vegas and Reno, and they offer year-round support, including food assistance, clothing, and school supplies as well. This is awesome, George. We love to see students and, students from tough communities or tough situations. They deserve a night of fun, and I think sometimes we forget the value of a night of fun teenage partying. That can go a long way into sustaining spirits. So awesome to see organizations recognizing that and helping out kids who deserve it.
I have to say, if you are a nonprofit that works in or around that population, teenagers, high school, prom is such an underutilized point of communication, of programming, and of an opportunity to ride a wave. Look up any stat you want on prom spending, prom behavior, prom searches, prom traffic. All of it is like X, what you think it is. And I think there's so many more opportunities for nonprofits dealing with teens to run these types of plug and play prom engagements, prom narratives, and promotions. Like, look into this, pull this thread. I promise you, every stat you see will be 2x what you think it is.
George, I believe it. I loved my proms. I had a great time at prom. I parallel parked for the first time. That was my big achievement there.
That's a big move on a big night. Good job.
Big move. Risky too. My date was impressed. All right, George, I have a joke for you. Are you ready?
How can one be ready for something like this? I'll do my best.
So true. You're not ready.
It's going to be terrible.
What did the leprechaun say after participating in the nonprofit's donation matching program?
Here's a pot of gold.
I'm doubling my impact.
Oh, God.
Get it? Doubling?
I do. I mean, it works. This joke brought to you by Double the Donation on St. Patrick's Day. Make sure you're doubling your donation. That one's free. The next one will cost you.
Gosh. All right. Thanks, George.
See ya.